Alright, hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So as always, I'm always shipping away at my PlayStation 2 collection, and I just wanted to give an update and give you guys some recommendations on some of the PlayStation 2 games here that I've been playing recently. I'm not going to name every single one here, but just to show you a preview of what to expect in this video. So what do you say we jump right in and tell you about the first one, which is Finny the Fish and the Seven Waters. Really glad I finally got around to checking this one out, because I've always been curious as to what kind of game this is. And it's essentially, the way I would describe it, it's like a survival 3D platformer where instead of jumping around on land like you would in a normal 3D platformer, you're actually doing platforming in water. I know that sounds kind of weird and crazy, but there's actually a lot of platforming sections where Finny the Fish jumps out of the water and you're actually hopping on platforms and everything. And it's a really great game for a younger audience. Not to say it's super easy or anything. There's actually some really difficult sections in this game where, as I was playing it, I was like, wow, this is pretty challenging for a quote unquote kids game. But I will say, if you're a fan of really light-hearted adventure games and you just love a PS2 game that has a really simple premise, you're just kind of swimming around helping different NPC characters solve little quests and doing very, very light, sort of like, I wouldn't even call it combat. I would say it's mostly just avoiding obstacles, avoiding enemies, and there's some really great voice acting in here. If you have kids, they would probably really enjoy watching you play this. It's just a very light-hearted action platformer adventure game that you can beat in one sitting. It probably takes you about 5 to 6, maybe 7 hours, depending on if you're trying to do everything in here, but I definitely recommend Finny the Fish. It's not going to be for everybody. And one more thing I wanted to say about this game, this is one of the best looking games I've seen when it comes to water. Of course, it's a game about a fish, right? But believe me, this game has some stunning water effects. Some of the environments here are just so beautiful and colorful. So if you want to see a PS2 game that pushes water effects to, I would say, almost their limits, check this one out. The next one here is a really interesting blend of genres. Another one that I've really been looking forward to checking out, and that is the Red Star. So this one is a combination of a beat 'em up. It's a 3D engine where you can pick from at the start of the game. You can pick between two different characters, I believe it was, and then there's a third character that you unlock after you beat the first playthrough. I chose the character that was more nimble and quick, prioritized in speed and melee attacks. But what really sets this apart is it's not just your standard typical beat 'em up. It also fuses in shoot 'em up elements that kind of will remind you of games like Ikaruga for the time, in terms of like how it's presented and the bullet patterns and stuff. There's no swapping back and forth between colors, but it's kind of like one of the better examples of what I can kind of compare it to from a game of this time. And it's really interesting. It's not a perfect game. I'd say if I had to give it a number rating, it's like a 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10 kind of game. There's some really wild difficulty swings in this game. There's no checkpoints in the levels, and there's very little health kits. So you can spend 10, 15 minutes on a level and then die at the very last boss and have to restart the whole level. So it does have that punishing difficulty. I'd say the best way I can summarize this game is it's like a simple series game, if you're familiar with those games from Japan, or the PAL imports. It's like a simple series game of like the highest tier. So kind of go in with those expectations. Feels a little low budget. You're not playing this game for the story, but if you're into beat 'em ups and shoot 'em ups, it's kind of a nice, interesting blending of the genres. Finally, came back to revisit Lord of the Rings: The Third Age. Now, I played this game when it came out, and I came back to revisit it. And I want to say one thing: I wish I would have got further in this game when I originally played it. But when I first played The Third Age, I was expecting something way different. This is an RPG where it's essentially just a lot of linear paths, and also sometimes really hard to navigate dungeons like in Moria, and it's just nonstop battles. Game is like 90% turn-based battles that can go on and drag on for quite a bit, and then the other 10% is just inventory management, leveling management, and like light dungeon crawling and opening chests and everything. But man, I dropped this game really quickly when this first came out. I played it day one. I was expecting something a bit more like a traditional RPG, maybe some more talking to NPCs and town exploration, and just, I don't know, something a little bit more than just like almost a straight up battle simulator. But coming back to this now, knowing what to expect from this game, I'm just going to say, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan and you like turn-based RPGs, this is an absolute essential must play. The sound design in this game is amazing. Every move and spell and attack in this game just has such punch and sound to it. It just, everything feels and looks so epic with the spell effects and the sounds. And of course, the music ripped straight from the films is just so fitting for this game. The story kind of like follows this ragtag group of characters that are always like one step behind the Fellowship. So, for example, when you go into the Mines of Moria, they will just happen to stumble upon the cave troll room right after the Fellowship dealt with the cave troll. But it's kind of neat in a way to follow in the footsteps. It's kind of cute, kind of gimmicky, but I liked it. But there's one thing I want to say about this game. This game now has one of my like top 10 all-time favorite boss battles in any RPG I've ever played, and that is the Balrog fight. He's on the cover, and he deserves to be on this cover. That fight has some amazing lighting effects. The fire, the smoke effects, the camera angles, the music, everything about that battle. Taking a half an hour to beat the Balrog. Like, this fight was going on, and the music was swelling. Gandalf joins your party. My normal party members are dying left and right. I'm like reviving them so they can keep healing Gandalf. Gandalf's there casting his spells, just battling the Balrog. And man, it was super impressive. I was very impressed with this fight. There's actually a lot I was impressed with this game when it came to the presentation and the graphics. I think this game looks phenomenal. I definitely wish I'd played more of it back in the day, because I don't remember fighting the Balrog back when I played it. I probably gave up before then, as did most people. But give this game another chance, really, especially if you're really getting back into Lord of the Rings. I think there's something really special here. You just got to be in the mood for something that's super grind heavy, a lot of slower turn-based battles, but I think there's something really special here for fans of Lord of the Rings and the RPG genre for turn-based battles. Oh man, I've been waiting so long to return to the Bloody Roar series. I was a huge fan of Bloody Roar 3 back in the day. I played that game when it first came out, really loved it, and up until now I haven't really touched the series, including, I will admit, I still have not played the original PlayStation 1 Bloody Roars. I got into the series with Bloody Roar 3, and I haven't played it again until Bloody Roar 4, and I was pleasantly surprised by this. A lot of people are saying this is like the dark horse of the series. A lot of people don't really care for it. I'll say I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Apparently, they changed some fighting mechanics that make this less appealing to your everyday fighting game fan, but for me, it was a game where I could like try and improvise. I don't want to say button mashing, but feeling out moves and like just kind of stringing together moves on the fly. I like those kind of fighting games where you don't have to like absolutely memorize combos and stringing together combos. You can kind of sit there, try and mash some buttons, figure out what the combos are, find them yourself, and really have a lot of fun with it. The music was super over the top. I love the sound effects in this game. Super arcadey. It reminds me of like a Dreamcast game. I had a ton of fun with this. Definitely would like to go back sometime and play this and go through with a few more characters, but it's a little hard to get this game these days, so I would only recommend this to hardcore Bloody Roar fans or fighting game fans in general. So here's one that kind of took me by surprise, and this is Hot Wheels. This is a long title, actually. It's Hot Wheels Interactive Velocity X Maximum Justice. That's quite the long title here, or more simply just known as Hot Wheels Velocity X. So I didn't know what to expect going into this. I haven't played a ton of Hot Wheels games, but what I came away with was being pleasantly surprised by a game that blends a lot of different genres. They've got some twisted metal aspects in here where there's actually car combat. There's arenas where you fight other cars, and it kind of plays just like a twisted metal game. There's racing, there's missions, there's just all kinds of stuff going on in this game, and it was a nice little breakup of different types of racing games or car games in general, car combat, what have you. There's stunt areas in here, so it's like all these different kinds of things all thrown together. The controls take a little bit of getting used to. They're kind of loose, they're kind of weird, but once you get down how to nail your tricks and land your tricks, it becomes a lot of fun. The music was super lacking in this game. That was probably one of the weakest elements, but the physics are also pretty good. So when you're riding on walls and going through loops, it's actually not guaranteed, not automated. You actually got to have some skill to maintain your momentum going up walls and even through loops and everything. Like if you're going over a loop and if you don't have enough speed, your car will just dead drop off of the loop. So if that sounds kind of cool to you, it's a Hot Wheels game where it's not super zoomed out. You're actually kind of like right up in the action, almost like a Twisted Metal game, like I said, or a normal racing game. So check this one out. It should be super cheap, pretty easy to get. I love this cover. I love this shiny cover. Look at this Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. Now, full disclosure, I played the first Ghost in the Shell on PlayStation 1 when I was really young. Didn't really remember too much. I never watched the show that this one is based on. I saw the original Ghost in the Shell movie when I was also really young. Don't really remember much, I will admit, and I think it's kind of important to come into this game having some familiarity with Ghost in the Shell, especially the show that this is based on, because the story was completely over my head. I had no interest in it, had no interest in the characters. But in terms of the gameplay, if you can kind of look past playing this and not having any familiarity with the source material, man, was I blown away by this game's the acrobatics in this game are phenomenal. The way that you can kind of jump around and do melee combat, it felt like almost like you were playing an Arkham Asylum style game at times on the PlayStation 2. Not that smooth, but as sort of like a comparison to make with the melee combat. And one other thing I was really impressed with in this game, and I didn't get this at the start, I had to get a few levels in. The level design is masterful at times. The way that this game will have you actually do parkour platforming, and what I mean by this is there will not always be a super obvious route through the level. And there were times where they took me by surprise where I was looking around, I'm like, where do I go? It feels like I'm in a dead end. And I'm looking up and I noticed, like, oh, there's some platforms up there. And you had to like jump off the walls of skyscrapers and land on the ledges and like shimmy across. Like, it was a really cool design in a lot of these levels. Some of them are hit or miss. Some, not all of them allow you to do parkour platforming because you switch between different characters. But overall, pretty solid action game. I was very impressed with the aesthetic of this. The music at times was quite fitting, even though maybe a little bit repetitive. I was able to enjoy it, having not much attachment to Ghost in the Shell, so I would recommend this for anybody that's into a bit more of third-person action games that have a lot of emphasis on melee combat and not just the gun shooting. All right, let's change direction here a little bit. Let's talk about some RPGs. So I went back and played Wizardry Tale of the Forsaken Land. Now, it's important to realize too, a lot of the PlayStation 2 games that I play here, I stream them, and then my audience is kind of in charge of when we drop a game. They're in charge of if I finish a game or if we move on to the next game. So in the case of Wizardry, it was one of those games where a lot of people kind of they were ready to move on from this game, and I feel like at one point I was kind of ready to move on too. So this is a really brutal dungeon crawler that starts off deceptively easy and progressively gets harder and harder and harder. I left off in a dungeon about, I don't know, 15 hours or so into the game that was probably one of the hardest dungeons I've ever seen ever in any RPG. It was in this graveyard and there were a lot of points where you can drop down and then there's like alternate paths underground to like warp you up to somewhere else in the level. And let me tell you, I looked at a map online on GameFAQs and I still could not figure out how to get past this dungeon. It was brutally difficult. And it was at that point, which was probably, I would say, almost halfway through the game, maybe a third of the way through the game, we were like, yeah, I think it's time for us to pack it up and move on to something else. But it was really interesting revisiting this game. I had played it a long time ago, around when it first came out. And it's one of the rare games that kind of nails that Etrian Odyssey uh, type of dungeon crawler on the PlayStation 2. The one thing that I underestimated with this game, especially when it first came out, is I appreciate now just how good the atmosphere is in this. The mood and the music and the graphics and it's in a 3D engine, which is very rare for a game in this genre. Normally now a lot of the enemies are 2D sprites, but everything is 3D and animated. All of your characters step forward and do attacks in the first person. All of the enemies step forward and do unique attack animations. It's really engrossing and it really helps keep you kind of captivated through the tons of battles that you're going to be doing in this game. But another thing that really impressed me was the combat system in this is not just your typical attack, cast a spell, and defend. They have these team attacks. I forget specifically what they call them in here. Allied actions. You do allied actions where you pick and choose certain party members. So, for example, say you have a mage in the back and you have a thief in the back. You can do an allied action with them and be like, okay, I want to protect these two party members in the front row, and if a character attacks one of those two party members, the two characters in the back that you selected will like counter and cast like arrows or stones or spells or whatever have you. Maybe you want to do like a group cast and do like more powerful attacks together as an allied group. There's all kinds of strategic counters and defenses and offenses that you can do to try and anticipate what the enemies are going to do, and it really elevates the combat in this game beyond what you're typically used to in the genre. I will just warn you though, be prepared. It's not an easy game, even with a map, and even if you're using a guide, which I only used towards the last dungeon that we kind of gave up on for that map. It's a challenging game, so be ready for it, but if you're a fan of games like Etrian Odyssey or similar games, you should definitely check it out. And now one of my favorite RPG dungeon crawlers, one of my favorite roguelikes, went back and did a new playthrough of Baroque. About 5 years ago, I was doing speedruns of this game. was able to beat it in about an hour and a half or so. But this was my first time that I came back to it and didn't attempt to speedrun it from the get-go, meaning I was fighting all the enemies, actually working on leveling and getting better gear, leveling up my character. Baroque is a really interesting roguelike. It's a third-person action roguelike where when this game came out, it got slammed because it was just so different at the time. It's a game where you need to die. You have to die to advance the story, and it resets you to level 1. You lose all your gear. You go through the beginning of the game again. People were not ready for games like this when this came out, so it got absolutely destroyed in the reviews. But now that people are much more used to that kind of mechanic in the roguelike genre, I think if you skipped on this one, you definitely got to check out Baroque. It's got a very horror-esque, super creepy, from software type of aesthetic to it, especially with the characters that you meet and the voice acting, the dark, brooding horror kind of atmosphere. This is a remake of the original Baroque, which was on PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn, which is coming to a bit more prominence these days due to English translations that have finally surfaced for the game. But I have not played this one yet. I've only played the remake, which I think is an absolutely phenomenal game. The story makes absolutely no sense. Even as many times as I beat this game and watched the unskippable cutscenes, I still cannot completely figure this game out. You're kind of just along for the ride. It's really weird. But if you enjoy horror aesthetic games, roguelike games, difficult and challenging games, or just something completely different and weird, I can't recommend Baroque enough. This is one, for those of you that may remember, in my first YouTube video ever, this was actually a game that I talked about back in 2008. And to this day, I'm still playing and loving the game. So some things never change for me in my weird little quirky RPGs. Uh, this is my price tag on here. There was a point where I tried selling this at a convention. I'm kind of glad I didn't because this game was so weird and dumb and silly. I'm glad that I was able to play it before I sold it. This is Outlaw Golf 2. I didn't play any other Outlaw Golfs. This is essentially a golf game that's completely satire, really weird, a lot of adult humor. Like you can play as a dominatrix that like beats up her sort of like slave a caddy person that brings around their golf clubs for them. It's it's over the top. It's M-rated for crude humor, language, sexual themes, and violence. So yeah, it's definitely not the kind of game you want to be playing around your kids or anybody that might look at this and be like, "What the heck are you playing?" Okay, like it's a fun game though. Like if you like these kind of weird mid 2000s games that we just don't really see anymore today, and you happen to like golf, it's actually a pretty good looking game in terms of the environments. The setting is actually pretty decent. I'm going to quickly glance over Beyond Good and Evil. This is one that I did mention in a recent video, but third time is still not the charm. I've attempted so many times to beat Beyond Good and Evil, and this time, ultimately, we did drop the ball towards the end. Like I said, I run sort of a gimmick with my PlayStation 2 games where sometimes I'm just forced to not be able to finish a game. So maybe in the future, when this 20th anniversary version I think that they're coming out with for Beyond Good and Evil, what that entails yet, I'm not actually sure. We'll give it another go, start fresh. But it was still an absolute blast to come back to this game and see how it pushed the envelope for the for the generation at the time for action games. This game is so cinematic, so over the top with its use of cinematic camera angles and music and voice acting and just the setting. And it tried to do a lot of things. Maybe it tried to do too many things in terms of being overly ambitious, but it's still a game that holds up fairly well. And if you've never played Beyond Good and Evil, I would say play one of the HD remakes or wait for that 20th anniversary edition. Maybe one of these days we'll see Beyond Good and Evil 2. It's probably going to be completely different though, so don't hold your breath. I played Kaya Dark Lineage. This is one that often gets compared to Jak and Daxter in terms of the aesthetics. The one thing that sets this one apart is the combat kind of almost acts like you're engaging in a 2D fighting game at times. It's not, the battles are not 2D, but when you get into combat, it will kind of like give this lock on camera that has a fighting game kind of control scheme where when you're doing your attacks, you're actually doing like fighting game inputs in a way. So it's not your typical like loosey goosey kind of like Jak and Daxter style free flowing combat system. It's a bit more locked on, almost like a Zelda game in a way with fighting game inputs. There's a lot of like rail grinding style sections. There is a lot of immersion breaking things in this game, like signs pointing you where to go, and like there's a little hub world that I think could have been handled a little better. It really makes me wish that this game was a bit more linear and not quite as open-ended as it tried to be. But if there's one thing this game has going for it, the visuals are actually really clean, really colorful. It really holds up. It's one of the better looking PlayStation 2 platformers out there, and this game is completely exclusive. You can't play this on any other platform. So if you're a fan of PS2 exclusives, if you're a fan of 2D platformers that have a focus on beat 'em up style combat, you should check it out. It's definitely in that mid tier. It's like a 6 out of 10, maybe 7 out of 10 kind of game. I've never been able to finish it. This time did not change that. People were kind of ready to move on. And funny enough, one of the games that we moved on to is Jak II. So my history of Jak II is really interesting in that Jak and Daxter on PS2 was one of my favorite 3D platformers of all time. Absolutely love that game and everything about it. I played Jak II when it came out, like almost everybody did that was a fan of Jak and Daxter, and I was shocked at how different this game was. The introduction of the open world city and the emphasis on a lot of backtracking through the city and flying around in the car, and of course the guns was such a shock to me at the time that it was hard for me to kind of look over that. Coming back to this now, and just to preface this, I never beat Jak II. I dropped this really early in the game because I was just so disappointed at the time with the direction they were taking Jak II, obviously trying to copy the Grand Theft Auto series. But coming back to it now, being able to come into this knowing what to expect, I'm able to get over the hurdles that I wasn't able to get over back then. I've made it further than I've ever made it in the game before. I just unlocked the hoverboard, which, yes, is very early in the game. So you can pretty much say this is my first playthrough that I'm doing right now of Jak II. And I've been really enjoying it. The one thing that I'm still having a hard time overcoming are the tons of backtracking through the main city, flying around on the hover bikes and stuff. That does get a little tiring after a while, but I can still really appreciate the scope and the scale and the physics and the controls and everything that they were going for in this game, especially looking back on it now. This game was super ahead of its time. But the one thing that I'm happy to say that I really don't mind anymore, especially because, well, it's not a shock to me anymore, the gunplay I'm actually really enjoying. I think it fits into the game just fine, and the combat, just how good and free flowing it is, and then you incorporate the guns into his normal like spin attacks and roll attacks and jump attacks. Like it just feels so good to incorporate the weapons into that. And then Dark Jak. I mean, I've really grown to appreciate this game more coming back to it now. That's what I will say. And the graphics still blow me away. Even playing the PlayStation 2 version, the frame rate is absolutely fantastic. I'm always impressed by the draw distance and the frame rate and everything that's going on and the animations and the cutscenes and how good the combat flows together. The lighting in this game, especially when you go into the nighttime areas or underground areas, what they do with the lighting is just, man, no other PS2 games are really doing that back then. I still absolutely prefer Jak and Daxter Precursor Legacy. I don't see this eclipsing that. Precursor Legacy is like nearly a 10 out of 10 game. It's like a 9.5 game for me. This right now is like an 8 out of 10. Maybe the further I get, and once I get into those environments that I love, the bright green outdoor environments, because right now a lot of it takes place in dark, dingy dungeons and like nighttime levels. Once I'm able to break free out of the city and see more of the really bright and cheery levels that kind of remind me of the first game, maybe this will kind of move up the echelon or the ladder of my favorite PlayStation 2 games, or PlayStation 2 platformers at least. But I will say, I'm glad I came back to this, and we'll see what happens. If you want to check out my journey through my first playthrough of Jak II, just check me out on Twitch, because that's where I'm streaming it. And we're gonna end it with a stinker. I know I was going to go out with a bang. I was going to save Jak II until the end, but I'm just going to warn you guys against one of the worst games I think I've ever played on PlayStation 2. And that is a game so bad that I couldn't even get past the tutorial. It's a game called Conflict Zone Modern War Strategy. So this game exists on other platforms. There's a Dreamcast version, there's a PC version, but the PS2 port in particular is disgustingly bad. Trying to take a game that uses mouse and keyboard controls, and transition it onto the PlayStation 2 controller was awful. The tutorial was incredibly hard to play, constantly throwing new convoluted controls at you. It's a real-time strategy game, so it's like the top-down, like you're commanding individual units, moving them across the map, building bases. That kind of stuff is really hard to pull off, especially back on the PlayStation 2. Very few games are attempting it, very few games did it correctly. And this is not an exception. This is a really bad game. I warn you against this. If you have it or if you ever see it, just know that this is really almost impossible to play on the PlayStation 2. We're talking like, oh, if you want to select one unit, hold L1, hold down on the D-pad, and then press triangle. And then if you want to deselect them, hold like right on the D-pad, hold R1, and then press circle or something like ridiculous stuff like that that you're never going to remember. So if you plan on playing this game, at least play it on PC. Maybe the Dreamcast version is better. The Metacritic score on the PS2 version definitely sums up the reason to stay away from that game. It's got like a 40 something. It's pretty low. So anyways, that is going to do it. Thank you so much for watching and sticking around. YouTube is going to recommend another video to you like right up here. So if you haven't checked out this latest video, click on it because YouTube thinks you will like it. And as always, guys, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.